Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony University. We're speaking with Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece. He's from the University of Divinity, the Centre for Research in Religion and Social Policy. Thanks for coming in, Gordon.
Pleasure, Norm.
We spoke to you about 12 months ago or so, I recall, and things have changed a bit since then, and one of them is this Centre for Religion and Social Peace policy, I should say. What's that about? It sounds pretty grand.
Well, we're relatively small, but we're growing, and we think we punch above our weight on looking at issues like ecology, economy, and wellness. So we're looking at some of the connections, if you like, between how creation functions and how it's going to survive and flourish, the links between, if you like, the house of creation and the household economy in the broader sense, because there's a link in the original term for both of those, and in terms of work, and we want to address things like precarious work, the nature of insecurity for people, and those sorts of things have effects on people's wellness. You know, if you're anxious all the time, you're not able to get enough work, etc., etc. Those sorts of things do affect people's health.
Yes.
So we're interested in researching those kinds of social issues as well as others, but they give us a certain focus.
And so what sort of disciplines do you include in the centre?
It's very multidisciplinary, but the University of Divinity is a grouping of a number of different colleges that ranges from Coptic Orthodox to Catholic to Baptist and Salvation Army and Anglican, Uniting, etc. So we draw on that ecumenical tradition, but also a range of disciplines. So while theology is our main game, there's pastoral disciplines, obviously related to areas of wellness. There's ethics, my own particular discipline. There's political theology, and how the specific relationship, for instance, between church and state. Those kinds of things all come into it, and we partner with other groups outside the university as well. Some church and other social agencies.
Yes.
And and other universities as well.
That's very encouraging. So the University of Divinity is a conglomeration of colleges. Which college do you attach to, or do you attach to the more central university concept?
I guess we're sort of planted, our centre, and I'm the director of it, is sort of planted in the middle of the university to facilitate the different colleges to converse with each other. And some of the colleges are relatively small, or you may have someone with a particular specialty, but then they're not able to necessarily talk about that specialty with others within their college. In some cases, we can provide connections with others, so you get a critical mass and try and build on their research. We also provide resources, like in terms of some media guidance, so people like Barney Schwartz and John Cleary are helping us, and so helping people to work out how do you translate the kind of more specialised language of theology and ethics and pastoral practice to the public sphere. And so we try and facilitate that for those groups.
Yeah, well, so you've been with it for about 12 months or so. How long has it been going? Is that when it originated?
I started in October last year, and we launched on the 8th of December.
Okay.
So it's relatively recent, but we've been able to do a number of have a number of seminars, get a number of publications out there, not just in theological journals, but also in the wider press. For instance, the Herald Sun recently, building on the major event that we had, which is our, if you like, the launch or inaugural public conversation, which we had between Professors Peter Singer and Margaret Somerville on the euthanasia and end-of-life issues.
Yes.
And so we often have events which then become public writing and can be videoed, and you get multiple use out of things like that to communicate with different sorts of publics and using different sorts of media.
That is a fantastic initiative, and it looks as though it's something that could grow quite significantly, particularly in relation to the media's reference point. The media was looking for a reference point, particularly in relation to religious issues, and you'd be emerging as fairly significant in that regard.
Yeah, we'd hope so. Given that we're an ecumenical body, that means, in a way, while there are differences, I think that the University of Divinity is able to basically manage its own differences and different perspectives, although from a shared Christian perspective, then if you like its own plurality, that's a good model for being able to dialogue with the wider society and the if you like, the wider plurality and pluralism in society.
Yes.
If we can't learn how to manage our differences as Christians, we're not going to be able to manage them very well in relationship to the wider society.
Exactly.
So we try and build on that experience. And University of Divinity's had over a century in terms of that.
Yes,
that sort of experience. So we would try and use that to further kind of civil public conversation.
Yes.
And that's a critical thing, because I think it's a time where, particularly in social media, but also in the mainstream media, there's greater division and a kind of echo chamber where people only hear their own voice echoed back to them in many ways. You get narrower kind of niches and more siloed off and from others. And so you just get reinforced by the people who will reinforce your own particular opinions. So we deliberately try and get dialogue going, and so the discussion on euthanasia and end-of-life choices with Margaret Somerville, who's coming from, for want of a better word, a more conservative perspective, and Peter Singer, who's approving of euthanasia, was a good model, I think, because they're both very civil. They did know each other, and that they have done some work together in the past, but it was robust. And
we'll have a robust discussion about it in a minute, because we're out of time.
Yep.
We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece from the University of Divinity. We were just before the break, we were just getting into this conference on euthanasia. So take us through that. You were there, you were a speaker.
Well, I'd organised it. The speakers were Professors Peter Singer and Margaret Somerville. They're both Australian but internationally recognised bioethicists.
Yes.
And they have different perspectives on the euthanasia issue. Peter Singer is pro-euthanasia, based on his particular perspective of utilitarianism, which wants to minimise the suffering of people, and also kind of maximise their autonomy and their preferences or choices. And whereas Margaret Somerville, she takes a more broadly relational view of human nature, and a more institutional kind of view in relationship to the character of medicine, the character of law. She's been involved in both of those institutions for a long time, and does this move towards having voluntary euthanasia and assisted dying, which the government is looking at bringing through the Parliament in August.
Yes.
Does that move fundamentally change both our view of human nature, our the basic taboo against killing, particularly killing in innocent life,
Yep.
and the nature of the two big institutional safeguards of human life, that is the law
Yep.
and the practice of medicine.
Yep.
And so that's kind of where the divide comes on that issue between both of them. And so we had a very civil debate, although there were some protesters outside, but that was a sign of, that was fine, that was non-violent, that was a sign of the significance of the issues.
Yeah.
But inside Collins Street Baptist, there were 400 people, and people raised very, very good questions. And I think the issues, I think, were clarified for people. So I think in terms of where the big issues lie, I think one is if you talk about people's fundamental sort of or even absolute autonomy and their individual choice, where do you draw the line in terms of that? Because the question is then, if they have complete choice over their dying, not just having the machines turned off, or et cetera, or being allowed to die, but actually saying, I want to be enabled to be killed, in effect, and or assisted in my suicide.
Yep.
They're not doing that by themselves. They're actually bringing in others, doctors, nurses, and the law in some ways,
Right.
to both assist and approve of that. And so it's not just an individual choice.
No.
That's something that has massive ripples through fundamental institutions in terms of our society and can change the character of those institutions. So Margaret Somerville, for instance, would say that, well, we really should have, if we were to go ahead with this, she doesn't want to go ahead with that, but if it was decided to go ahead with it, then you actually need to come up with another profession to do it. And so there's a fancy word for it based on thanatos, which is the Greek word for death.
Yes.
But they would be sort of death practitioners, or a bit like when they used to talk about Dr. Death.
Yes.
In the US, and because otherwise you're going to change the fundamental nature of medicine. And it's interesting. The evidence in Canada, particularly in Toronto recently, that I saw, was that they're having trouble getting enough doctors to actually do that. Doctors don't want to actually be involved in the practice of assisted suicide. And and it's regarded as, there are also issues about a kind of almost PTSD, a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder of people who are involved too much in that.
Right.
So these are some of the things that are starting to show up. I think one of the other major issues is that autonomy is made into an absolute. So you can say, well, we'll only do this in the case of people with a terminal illness, and that is relatively imminent, let's say in 12 months or something like that. But what we're seeing across a range of places, from Holland to Belgium to Oregon to Canada, is that you start to increase the range of people with access, because the logic of autonomy, of self-rule and self-choice, doesn't really have any limits to it. That leads to a slippery slope. And when you join that with kind of individual human rights, then people are actually suing in order to have the right to be able to access assisted suicide.
Yes.
When they have non-terminal illnesses.
Yes.
Or in Holland, they've brought in what's called completed life. So you don't necessarily have to have any severe illness or whatever. You may just feel like, yeah, well, I've done what I want to do. I've ticked off my bucket list, and I want to say goodbye. That kind of case came up with a couple on Q&A a couple of months ago, for instance.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be, old and end of life, or with a terminal illness. You could just be a teenager, and
Yes.
and you may decide in terms of that. Well, one of my big problems with the advocacy of euthanasia is that it actually validates suicide. It's interesting the government doesn't actually even use the term, say, assisted suicide. They actually avoid that term. They talk about assisted dying, but it's actually assisted suicide. It's interesting when you have something, say, on the 730 report talking about a carer and someone who has a terminal illness, and they're wanting to have assisted suicide. As soon as it finishes, you get call Lifeline or call Beyond Blue, etc.
That's right.
Because people know that people will start thinking about suicide.
Absolutely. And time is the issue for them and for us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony in Diversity. We're speaking with Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece from the University of Divinity. And this is fascinating, what was discussed at that public conversation, because it's obviously covering really, really critical issues. And you had two significant people able to maintain a respectful and informative conversation. Quite a breakthrough.
Yeah, the fact that they have been colleagues before helps in terms of that. I suppose what we try to do is build on a kind of friendship model. Friendship not just as kind of, hand-holding kind of stuff, but the ancient model of friendship was that you were friends within the city or the polis.
Yes.
So there was something bigger than you, and you engaged with that, seeking the common good. So that's the kind of model that we're trying to use, and to use that sometimes with, it's a term Francis Schaeffer used many years ago in a book on pollution and the death of man, which is, I think, one of his best books. He was quite early on that issue of pollution. But at the end of it, he talked about being co-belligerence was the word. Yeah. So you're fighting the same battles, but you may not share the same presuppositions.
Yes. Yeah.
So, for instance, with Peter Singer, I have very different presuppositions to him, as Margaret would. But I would be supportive with him on climate change issues or the rights of animals or poverty, things like that. But we have pretty different views, say, on euthanasia, for instance, and that.
We might go into that a bit later, because that goes into freedom of speech and a whole lot of other issues. But you raised some interesting ones here, like the issue of maybe a person using it, a person using this completed life as being a criteria. And you said that had actually happened. Was it in Holland? Was it?
So they're bringing in legislation in terms of that. Another case would be on the Dateline show from Belgium that was on SBS, and it was clear that the reporter was shocked at what he saw with an 85-year-old woman who was riding her exercise bike quite vigorously. She was in great health, but she was about to be euthanized, voluntarily euthanized by her doctor. And when you dug down into the issue, the reason was she had lost one of her daughters, and she was quite devastated by that, and she was estranged from the other daughter. The other daughter hadn't been told about this whatsoever, so she would just one day perhaps find out accidentally that her mother had chosen to end her life. And so again, there's this sense of individualism and not actually dealing with the relational kinds of issues, family issues that are involved in actually having a good death, in a sense. Like the old Puritans and the Victorians, the patriarchs, they would gather people together.
Yes.
And they would give them a blessing. And pass on whatever wisdom that they wanted to pass on to them and the inheritance. And it seems to me that we are so scared of death and dying, and that in many ways I think we're projecting our own fear of death and of suffering and dying onto those who are in the process.
Yes.
I also think there's a danger, and Margaret Somerville raises this, about elder abuse. And there's been reports into high levels of this in New South Wales. The various medical bodies have said somewhere between 4 and 14% of cases are involved with elderly people, cases of elder abuse. And I think that is something it's a real danger. You know, come and sort out your mortgage in Sydney by basically putting the pressure on for someone to die. So you would not only have what's apparently been called something like early inheritance syndrome, but early death syndrome. And anyone who's been a minister like I have, and you take funerals, you do sometimes see people who come out of the woodwork. You know, they haven't been around for a while, etc. You know, there are people who are sometimes looking to get in on the inheritance.
Yes.
And I think we need to be realistic about human nature in that way. So the evidence is that there is a slippery slope, and in the places that do have voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide, that it expands. And the interesting thing recently is that both people have come out recently in Holland. So we published an article by Dr. De Boer, who was on the board that oversaw euthanasia in Holland, and he had previously approved voluntary euthanasia, but he saw the slippery slope, and now he's turned against it. Another Dutch psychiatrist has also turned against it, and he says there are so many loopholes now that it's really dangerous. The person who heads up the Quebec Medical Registration Board, also a strong proponent of euthanasia, has now argued that the slippery slope has just accelerated, and anyone can ask for euthanasia on just about any grounds, and is extremely concerned about that. So they're three very, very prominent former advocates of euthanasia and assisted suicide who are now sounding the alarm bells.
It's sort of like a menu for dying. As it sort of
death a la carte. Or a bit of a smorgasbord.
Yes, that's right.
There's a bit of black humour going on here, but so that's one of the dangers. One of the things that Peter Singer said, picking up on John Cleary's talking about his mother's dying, and the doctor sort of saying, well, she'll die when she chooses, and he was upping the level of morphine. And that was unclear to John exactly what was being said there. But Peter really ran with that and basically assumed that he was talking about euthanasia. And there was
I'll need to interrupt you because we're out of time, and I need to talk to you more. So can you come back next week, please? Okay. Because this is a big topic.
All right, we'll leave people in suspense.
Yes, thanks very much. You've been watching Harmony in Diversity, and we will be back next week talking to Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.
Shanti Om.